So you know, Will.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Is Will here?
Will? Anybody named Will?
Should I hook that?
No.
All right, we're missing something.
Oh wait, that won't really work. Well, if only I had man clothes on.
All right, well, we're missing our student, but we'll go ahead anyway. So I'm Tom Carrico. Thank you all for coming. I think we have a great conversation tonight ahead of us. Our topic is free speech, safe spaces, and academic freedom. This is, of course, a very timely debate in one sense, just because there's been so much attention to this issue really nationwide at a lot of different colleges, a lot of discussion about kind of what the boundaries are for controversial speakers, but then also how you kind of manage some of that controversy. We've seen national stories about speakers coming in deliberately provoking things, and also speakers kind of shouted down. Some of it egged on from one side or the other. And I think it's fair to say that none of that kind of fits what we like to think of as Kenyon as civil and sober discourse. And I'm reminded that in, I think it was 2013, we had Charles Murray here in 2013, and there was some controversy about that. But what I remember is a very full Ross Hall with a lot of really tough questions, and I think a very impressive conversation that followed. So this larger question of civil and sober discourse that kind of gets us started tonight. It's also timely here at Kenyon for a couple of other reasons. One, that the faculty is having a conversation about a statement about academic freedom. And kind of in this larger context, President Decatur had reached out to the fire organization some time ago and said, you know, maybe we can have a conversation here on campus. And so this is kind of a product of that conversation. And finally, this September, CSAD will be hosting one of its big every other year conferences, and this one is going to be on the topic of free speech and these associated questions. And so I am going to also introduce our speaker. Susan Kruth is went to New York University. Sorry, I have just seen this bio because I wasn't supposed to do this. She went to the University of Virginia School of Law, and she worked at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund and the ACLU LGBT and AIDS Project. She's got her JD and is a member of the Virginia Bar. She's worked at the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Protection of Free Speech in Charlottesville before moving now to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. And she now works in FIRE's Legal and Public Advocacy Department. So please join me in giving a warm Kenyon welcome to Susan Kruth.
Thank you for inviting me to speak about this important topic. As Tom said, I am Susan Kruth, and I work for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, or FIRE, and we're a nonprofit organization that defends freedom of expression and due process on college campuses. Due process in that context just means making sure that students get a fair hearing before they're punished for something that they're accused of doing wrong. So I'm going to talk about free speech today, but I want to make clear that if you have questions about due process, you can feel free to come up to me afterwards, and I'm happy to ask any questions about, or I'm happy to answer any questions about anything within FIRE's mission. But for now, let's focus on free speech. I'm going to start with a quick overview of your First Amendment free speech rights. Generally speaking, just to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to the legal basics. I assume you're all adults, you all look like adults, so that means that you can fully enjoy your First Amendment rights when you're off campus and in public spaces. And I think that it's always good for everyone to just know at least the basics of their First Amendment rights so that you can assert those rights when you need to. And the first thing that I always tell people is that the vast majority of speech is constitutionally protected under the First Amendment, even when it's highly offensive or hateful or hurtful. There are just a few categories of speech that are unprotected. There's about 7 of them, depending on how exactly you count, and they're all very narrowly defined. The Supreme Court has also been extremely reluctant to create new categories of unprotected speech. It's had the opportunity to do so in a couple different Supreme Court cases in recent years, and it's declined to do that. So these categories of unprotected speech include things like true threats, incitement to imminent lawless action, and defamation. But it's important to remember that these categories are all defined much more narrowly under the law than the way that we use these words when we're just speaking about them casually or colloquially. For example, obscenity is one example of that. It's not just any pornography, there's a 3-part test. And in addition to that, fighting words has been over time narrowed by the courts to really near non-existence as an unprotected category of speech. So I'm not going to go over all the different categories of unprotected speech because, like I said, they each come with sort of multi-part definitions and case law. If you're interested in reading more about the specifics, then I recommend you check out FIRE's Guide to Free Speech, which is available on our website at thefire.org. But the gist of these categories is if you're not trying to concretely harm someone, so that's more than just hurting someone's feelings, then your speech is probably protected under the First Amendment. And even if you are trying to concretely harm someone, your speech might still be protected under the First Amendment depending on other circumstances. So that's the gist of things. As a side note, when I talk about unprotected categories of speech, I often get 2 types of what about questions. The first one is, what about if a student is stalking another student or harassing them? That's a good question. Harassment is punishable, consistent with the First Amendment. If a student cannot receive his or her education because they're being targeted by severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive conduct, that's not protected expression under the First Amendment. So even if there are broad speech protections, you're not without recourse if harassment is preventing you from receiving your education. The other question that I get a lot of the time is, what about hate speech? Hate speech is not an unprotected category of speech, so the vast majority of what people would call hate speech is protected. And I'm going to talk about why that's a good thing a little bit later. So your speech is broadly protected in public spaces, like city parks and that sort of thing, but it's also broadly protected on public college campuses. So obviously you're on a private college campus now, but if you go to grad school someplace else, you can keep that in mind. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, but it doesn't just literally limit Congress, it also limits the ability of other governmental entities to punish or censor speech based on the content or viewpoint. Private colleges like Kenyon aren't bound by the First Amendment, of course, so if they want to, they can say, we only want people with certain viewpoints or who believe certain things to be part of our campus community. And many religious colleges do this. They openly prioritize other values over freedom of expression, and they're allowed to do that. It's part of their associational rights under the First Amendment. But actually most private colleges promise their students and professors free speech rights just like they would have at a public university. And so when private colleges do that, they have to follow through on that promise. They have to, they can't reap the benefits of advertising themselves one way and then behave differently once students matriculate. So when I talk about free speech on campus, I want you to think about it in the context of public colleges, which are bound by the First Amendment, but also private colleges that promise free speech. And Kenyon is one of those colleges. So we'll set aside for now the colleges that openly prioritize other values. With respect to most universities, they serve a critically important purpose, not just for the campus community, but also for the nation at large. They're supposed to be places where people can explore a whole range of ideas, but especially challenging and innovative ones. So students don't just learn facts, but they learn how to think critically and do research and debate with each other. For a lot of students, it's the first time that they really encounter people who are very different from them with different values. Before college, obviously, it's very easy to grow up in a bubble and maybe you only hear certain ideas. Maybe you're only exposed to one religion or one side of the political spectrum. But at college, as you know, people come from all over the world to share their lives with each other. So as all these very different people meet each other for the first time and ask each other questions and sometimes have some of their most fundamental beliefs challenged, it's sort of inevitable that they're going to trip over themselves sometimes or trip over each other or make what others see as mistakes. And this is just part of the learning process. It's part of meeting people who are very different from you. But if students aren't allowed the leeway to mess up or do what other people perceive as messing up, then they're not going to be able to enjoy all the benefits of being at the university. And that's not to say that they can't be criticized if someone thinks that they're making a mistake. After all, part of college is learning how to take criticism too, even harsh criticism. But students need to at least know that their place at the university is safe, that they're not going to be kicked off campus because they asked the wrong question or engaged in a debate that made someone upset. And professors also need leeway to explore new ideas through their scholarship and research. Professors are oftentimes at the cutting edge of their fields of study, and they can't push forward and they can't make progress in the same way, or even honestly criticize the work of their peers sometimes if they're afraid that they're going to be officially sanctioned because they say something that's considered beyond the pale. And after all, a lot of the ideas and information that we take for granted now at one time did seem beyond the pale. So this is extremely important. And this isn't just what FIRE believes. The Supreme Court has reiterated time and again that the purpose of colleges and universities is to serve as a marketplace of ideas, places where students can debate with each other and beliefs can clash and people can make each other mad and offended. And the Supreme Court wrote, for example, in the seminal student speech case, Tinker versus Des Moines, the vigilant protection of constitutional freedoms is nowhere more vital than in the community of American schools. So that's a pretty strong statement. This case involved junior high school students who were told that they couldn't wear black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And the court found for the students. And even though primary and secondary school students actually don't enjoy all of the same First Amendment protections in school that college students do, or that adults do outside the educational context, the court was still very careful to say that even these younger students in school still had free speech rights. So it went on to re-emphasize the importance of free speech, especially in the educational context, in a number of other subsequent cases, including, of course, cases involving college students. The Supreme Court also acknowledged the importance of professors' ability to explore through their own scholarship and teaching. And it even distinguished professors at public schools from other governmental employees. Without getting into too much detail of this case, the court held in Garcetti versus Ceballos that the government could punish otherwise protected speech in the context of government employees performing their job duties. They couldn't send them to jail, but they could punish them the way that other employers could punish employees, so discipline or firing them. And in this context, the government is basically acting more as an employer than the government normally. But importantly, the court also said that the holding of that case did not necessarily apply to expression related to academic scholarship or classroom instruction. So essentially, government employees generally can have their expressive rights curtailed on the job, but much less so with public school teachers and public college professors. Their job is expression and thought, and they were hired in part for their ability to think and to communicate even their own ideas. So in this way, the public college professor is really different from any other type of government employee, including other employees at the university, like purely administrative positions or custodial staff. So this is all just to say that the Supreme Court has been very consistent about the importance of free speech on campus, even when it requires this sort of carve out in another area of law. And I like for students to know the breadth of their First Amendment rights so that they can defend them if necessary. But talking about the law, I know, does not address a lot of the concerns that students and professors have about free speech on campus. And at private colleges, where the First Amendment doesn't prohibit speech restrictive policies, obviously policy writers need another reason to allow even the speech that most of their students will despise. So this brings me back to the question from before, what about hate speech? And I like talking about hate speech because I think that it helps illustrate a lot of the problems with trying to censor speech, and it also illustrates some of the benefits of allowing even the speech that we don't like. Obviously, lots of people are on board with the idea of prohibiting hate speech, but if you asked all of those people how they would define hate speech, I think that you would get a lot of different answers, and they wouldn't all be compatible with each other. Since hate speech is not an unprotected category of speech here in the US, there's no legal definition for it here. And various attempts to get at the gist of hate speech all have their own problems. So for just one example, the State Department tried defining anti-Semitism, thankfully not for enforcement, but just for their own internal discussions about the issue. And here's what it came up with. A certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. A certain perception. They're basically saying, if you don't know, we're not going to tell you, which is not very helpful. And the department doesn't really limit anti-Semitism to hatred of Jews per se. It says it can be expressed as hatred, although presumably that means it can be expressed another way, or maybe it's not expressed at all, it's just a certain perception. So this is what the government came up with. I've heard some students describe hate speech as degrading others or punching down. So basically targeting someone who is more marginalized than you. And I think this is interesting, but I don't think it works because some people deserve to be punched down on. And at the risk of betraying my political leanings, which I usually try not to do, I'm going to use the example of the Westboro Baptist Church. This is the group, if anyone is not familiar with them, they're the group that hangs out on sidewalks and has those neon signs that say that soldiers or gay people or any number of groups are burning in hell. Now, relative to the people who protest them, and often they have many, many passionate protesters, relative to that group, practically nobody takes them seriously. They're dwindling in numbers. Usually when they protest, there's like 2 of them, and possibly hundreds of people who disagree with them. And they've been called the most hated family in America. So hating on the Westboro Baptist Church is punching down, but I think that many people, and probably including a lot of the people who would argue for hate speech laws, think that they deserve it. So I think that definition of hate speech doesn't really work. And this line drawing problem just gets worse as we look at more examples of what people might find objectionable. So for example, many religions have customs or beliefs that other people think are barbaric or illogical. So is it hate speech to call those believers or those practitioners barbaric and illogical? A lot of people think it is. Other people think that calling out religiously mandated violence is just an integral part of fighting for human rights around the globe. And still other people will sort of pick and choose their answer based on whether the practice in question happens to be something that they're used to, maybe something that's common in the US. But however you define hate speech, chances are that it can be twisted to punish earnest objections to things that maybe you think are objectionable too. Now, the problem isn't just with writing a law or a rule at school, but also with enforcing it. Advocates for hate speech bans often say that they're necessary to protect marginalized groups. But I have to wonder what it is in our history that makes them so confident that anyone with the authority to enforce such bans would suddenly use their power to protect the little guy. To the contrary, history, and if nothing else, FIRE's case archives demonstrates that when people do have the discretion to enforce these ambiguous or vaguely worded speech restrictive policies, they use their power to censor or punish speech that they don't like. And of course, a lot of the time that includes speech of people who are already silenced or already victimized. So I think a lot of advocates for speech restrictive policies undermine just how colossally things can go wrong, specifically at the enforcement stage of things, even if the underlying policy is not too bad. To illustrate this, I'll tell one of my favorite horror stories, which is not as much of an outlier as one would hope. I was lucky enough to be flown up to Alaska to speak with the then editor-in-chief of the student newspaper up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. To speak with her about her experience when the student newspaper was investigated for 10 months because of a sexual harassment allegation. 2 articles prompted this investigation. There weren't allegations outside the articles, it was just 2 newspaper articles. One was an April Fool's Day article that said that the university was constructing a building shaped like a vagina, presumably to complement all the penis-shaped buildings that already exist. Now, you don't have to think this is funny. I tend to get very mixed reactions on this, but suffice to say, no one's life was turned upside down by this article. The second article was an investigative report on the Facebook UAF confessions page. And what happened was that there were some students who posted some rude and insulting comments on this confessions page, and the newspaper reported on this phenomenon. It quoted some of the posts because they were public, and it talked to one of the targets of the rude posts, and she participated willingly, of course, and was eager to share her perspective and her point of view. So there weren't any allegations that anything in the article was untrue or that it made public anything that was private or anything like that. But despite all this, a professor's complaint that these articles constituted sexual harassment spurred an investigation that lasted nearly a year, from April to February. And the investigation only stopped after FIRE wrote to the school and said, a public university cannot subject a newspaper to this kind of lengthy investigation for speech that's clearly protected under the First Amendment. So who knows how long this investigation would have gone on if not for our letter. Now, that's bad enough on its own. I got to talk to the editor more, and she said that during these 10 months, she had planned and was actually quite excited about this longer piece that she was writing about the serious issue of sexual assault on campus, including providing resources for survivors. But she never published it because she was afraid that she was going to get in more trouble or endanger the newspaper. And especially she was afraid that either the same professor would complain about this article too, or maybe that someone else would be offended. And it could have been really helpful to a lot of students, and yes, it would have been just a purely informational article, but so was the second article that she got investigated for, or that the newspaper got investigated for. It was purely informational. So she had good reason to think that she might have gotten in trouble for this article too. So there's college enforcement for you. Hopefully nothing like that happens at Kenyon, and I haven't heard of anything like that happening at Kenyon, which is a good sign, but we've seen too many cases that are similar to this at colleges across the country. Policies meant to protect vulnerable students get enforced in a way that works against the interests of those same students. Now, you can't prevent this from happening altogether, but having clear and narrowly written speech policies is a really good place to start. Shifting back to the hate speech example, there are still more problems with hate speech bans, even besides the ability to draw a clear line and enforce them in as neutral a manner as possible. Even if hate speech laws are enforced the way that you would want them to, what then? The result would be that people with extremist views would only speak to people who they know already agree with them, letting their views become even more extreme, except this time with no checks and balances of other people sort of chipping in their ideas. Think of how you are with your friends when you talk about something that you feel really strongly about. If you're anything like me and my friends, you feed off each other's energy, and sometimes you end up feeling even more strongly at the end of a big rant session, right? So this is natural, but you have to remember that people with opinions that are different from yours, sometimes viewpoints that are polar opposites or viewpoints that you find despicable, experience the same thing. And of course, it's their right to do that, but do you really want to be forcing them to do that all the time? So to avoid making matters worse for minorities, either demographically or ideologically, we leave hate speech alone, legally speaking. But there are benefits to this too, especially benefits for you guys as students and academics. A common saying among fire staff and our allies is, I want to know who the Nazi in the room is. Bigotry will always exist, sadly, but as long as hate speech isn't banned, bigots will largely out themselves. And once they do, you can decide if you want to ignore them and cut them out of your life, or engage with them, or publicly shame them, or any other number of responses. If hate speech is banned and bigots are forced to hide who they really are, then all of our decisions about how we treat people, who we elect to office, and who we trust are going to be uninformed, or at least less informed. And this can't possibly benefit us, but it certainly benefits them. Some of the advantages of letting bigots out themselves sort of increase as their speech gets more extreme. Often they'll just shoot themselves in the foot. They'll turn people off with their blatantly hateful tone or the harsh way that they communicate. But if they're forced to tone down, people might actually be more inclined to listen to what they have to say. They might be even more persuaded. So that should be the last thing that you want if your goal is fighting hate. And hate speech, especially the kind with that really jarring tone, can also serve as a wake-up call for people who maybe don't realize that there's still problems with racism and other types of bigotry here in the US. Because it's a lot harder to deny a problem if there's people who are shouting racial slurs in the street compared to if everyone is just on their best behavior all the time in public. And this works the same way from other points along the political spectrum and way beyond the realm of hate speech alone. So to use a completely different scenario, say you are fighting against an increase in sexual deviancy among young people, and all of a sudden there's a guy on the quad and he's doing a public reading of his manifesto, 50 Shades of Why I Want to Have Sex with a Horse, then your job is pretty much done for you. But if he's censored because his speech is inappropriate, well, all of a sudden your evidence is gone. None of this is to say that you can't encourage civility or encourage people to use a certain tone on campus. And colleges and universities themselves, the administrators, can encourage civility too. A lot of the benefits of free expression can't be fully realized if everyone's just yelling at each other all the time. Like I said before, colleges are meant to be spaces where students can learn how to think critically and debate with each other. So especially on campus, I encourage students and everyone in the campus community really to try to have frank discussions with people that you disagree with. That includes a lot of listening to ideas that you might consider ridiculous or appalling, which can be hard. But the most obvious potential benefit of this is that if you talk to someone, they might actually realize that they're wrong and you're right. This probably won't happen completely or immediately, but at the very least, maybe You will better understand and learn to address maybe one or two of their points or their concerns. Maybe you'll learn a weakness in your own argument that you can better address next time you have a similar conversation. Or maybe there's a third party observing who was undecided, but was actually really convinced by your argument. And that actually might be the point that's most worth focusing on, because for any big controversial issue, there are going to be probably a lot of people who are on the fence. And I think you have to be pretty pessimistic to think that if you're pitted against your opponent, that you're not going to be convincing to at least somebody who might be watching. Of course, the benefit that we're all a little bit reluctant to accept is the possibility that we might actually be wrong, or we might be missing information that adds some nuance to our views. And I think you might especially want to consider this possibility if you honestly think that you can't actually be persuasive to anybody. But in any case, just the process of talking with someone who is actively challenging you and asking you questions, at the very least, will help you hone your debate skills, and that will work to your benefit in the long run. Refusing to engage someone just because their tone or their language doesn't match yours exactly deprives you and deprives other people of all these benefits of the discussion. With that said, no person can fight this fight every single time the opportunity comes up. We are human, we need time to take a break, and we need time to be alone and recover from these emotionally draining conversations, or to steel ourselves for new ones that we see coming up, which leads me to the topic of safe spaces. I often get really annoyed when I listen to people talk about safe spaces, because so much of the time people just talk past each other. The people debating this topic don't always sit down and figure out exactly what it is that they're talking about. And there are several different kinds of safe spaces that I've seen people suggest or implement or talk about on campus. Some of them are easily defensible and other kinds are less so. So there are two important distinctions that need to be made at the outset when we're having this conversation. The first is whether safe refers to students' physical safety, or whether it refers to students' ability to avoid upsetting ideas or speech. Universities should, of course, take steps to ensure physical safety, and like I said before, they can punish true threats, incitement to imminent lawless action, harassment, and of course they can punish and should punish physical violence. But emotional safety can't be guaranteed at a public institution or a private college that promises free speech rights. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has repeatedly emphasized that even highly offensive expression has to be allowed in order to protect robust public debate on college campuses and elsewhere. The second distinction we have to make is whether the safe space in question is a part of campus that students can choose to gather in, or whether it's an administratively enforced, either campus-wide or classroom-wide ban on certain types of speech. If students are simply associating with each other, voluntarily finding people with whom they feel comfortable and going to a particular place on campus, that really doesn't hinder other students' ability to express themselves in the vast majority of campus. And it can actually be a really valuable tool for people who do want to participate in campus discussions, because a lot of the time their arguments to the public are going to be better formed and more articulate if they have these conversations with their allies, with people who agree with them before that happens. And finally, at public institutions, the First Amendment actually protects students' rights to associate in that way. So if students feel like their voluntary association with their peers is a safe space, and that's what they want to call it, then that creates no danger for free expression on campus. But administrators at either public colleges or private colleges that promise free expression can't try to create an environment where everyone on campus is comfortable all the time. If the entire campus is going to be a safe space, it can only be in the context of everyone feeling safe to express themselves without fear of administrative punishment. So, assuming that we're talking about safe spaces as voluntary gatherings within a part of campus, I also encourage students to use these safe spaces in order to prepare for engagement with people that they disagree with, rather than to avoid it completely at all times. Sometimes during controversial campus events, you'll see there will be a safe space set up for people to dip into when they feel like they need to. Now, I'm not gonna take issue with the Play-Doh and the puppies, which I know is very popular to do, but I like Play-Doh and puppies too, so I really don't understand the focus on that. But I wish that the emphasis was more on making sure that these spaces are available before the event, so that people can use them to prepare, to get calm and ready to engage with the people who they disagree with and challenge them. Now, it's every student's right to decide not to engage. Of course, you can't engage all the time, but I think that many goals would be better served with this strategy, at least if this strategy is encouraged. So between all the different kinds of safe spaces and the different ways they can be used, it's frustrating for me to see articles and letters and blogs all about safe spaces with no real clarification as far as what the author is advocating for or against exactly. And the same is true of other topics: trigger warnings, Title IX, feminism, men's rights, hate speech. And campus censors benefit enormously from people not taking the time to define ambiguous terminology, because they can censor with minimal criticism just by taking expression they don't like and slapping a label on it and assuming that no one is really going to question it. And usually they don't. So for example, a sarcastic comment about guns is a threat, or a joke about vaginas is sexual harassment. Think of the newspaper case in Alaska. The label of sexual harassment is an especially powerful one because, of course, no administrator or faculty member wants to be seen as soft on sexual misconduct. But in recent years especially, the federal government has instructed colleges to redefine sexual harassment in a way that could include practically any speech about sex at all, which, as you would probably expect, poses a huge threat to free speech on campuses. Here's how it happened. The Office for Civil Rights, which enforces Title IX's sex discrimination prohibition, and the Department of Justice together investigated the University of Montana and how it dealt with sexual assault allegations. And at the conclusion of this investigation, they released a findings letter and a resolution agreement that called itself a blueprint for colleges and universities nationwide to deal with this problem. So essentially they said, colleges, you should follow in the University of Montana's footsteps on this issue. And they said, among other directives, that the university had to define sexual harassment as any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, including verbal conduct, which is speech. There are basically no limiting factors on that definition. And in contrast, there are many limiting factors on the Supreme Court's definition of student-on-student sexual harassment. Just to start, it has to be something that interferes with someone receiving their education. It can't just be something that mildly offends someone. But with this new definition, it just has to be related to sex in some way, and it has to be perceived by somebody as unwelcome or offensive. Somebody, anybody, even someone who's unusually sensitive. So this could be a fellow student who doesn't want to hear your argument about why trans women should be allowed in the women's restroom. It could be a guy who's grossed out that you asked the girl next to you for a tampon. It could be your date who's offended that you asked when the last time they got STD tested was. This is just in theory. What does a policy like this blueprint definition of sexual harassment look like when it's applied in real life? Well, I can tell you that it's about as counterproductive as the newspaper situation in Alaska. A tenured education professor at Louisiana State University was fired under a sexual harassment policy that looked just like the blueprint after she made a joke in class about lesbians wearing brown pants, and she said the word pussy. It wasn't directed at any student. It was in the context of her explaining some of the language that her students might hear in the context of doing their jobs in the future, these jobs that the professor was training them to do. So previously, this professor had been widely lauded as essentially a gift to the Louisiana state education system. And this is exactly the sort of person who you would expect to receive at least some sort of deference on the topic of how she teaches her students. But it took only a couple of these offhand, not targeted remarks for her to be thrown out of LSU, even though she had tenure, and even over the objections of her faculty peers who said that she should not be fired for this. When someone is found responsible for sexual harassment under these incredibly broad policies, it's easy for free speech advocates to know that they might not actually be morally culpable. But it's also easy for someone who's not familiar with this situation. If someone supports this professor or objects to the harassment policy, it's easy for them to say, what, you support sexual harassers? Because that's what they'll think. And in a culture where people are so often too snarky or too impatient to define the terms being discussed, it only facilitates this sort of manipulation by would-be censors. People assume that all the other people talking about sexual harassment or safe spaces or whatever are talking about the same thing that they're talking about. But a lot of the time, they're not. On the topic of defining buzzwords, I know that there has been a debate at Kenyon in recent months involving his campus and her campus. From what I've read, some students were objecting to generalized statements made about feminism and liberals, and other students were objecting to what they perceived as a hostility towards conservative views. And I know that there's a lot more on either side. I haven't read it all, and it looks like some of what's been posted has been deleted, but I hope that this conversation continues on campus. I also hope that both sides are specific enough in their arguments that there isn't as much of this kind of disconnect, especially this disconnect over terms. I think both sides of the debate probably have something that they can learn from the other side. If a number of posts were deleted, which it looks like that might be the case, but it's hard for me to tell, then that's disappointing to see potential avenues for discussion being erased. But it is encouraging to see the Kenyon Collegian host statements from both sides of the debate. And so if there are any newspaper editors in the audience, thank you. It's invaluable to have an outlet that will give students with different viewpoints the same shot at expressing their viewpoints and trying to persuade their peers. And impressively, it also demonstrates a grasp on a principle that a lot of college administrators struggle with enormously, which is that providing a space for different viewpoints to be expressed, or even defending the rights of students to express those viewpoints, is not the same thing as an endorsement of those viewpoints. So collegian editors, I know it's sort of sparse on students, but if there's any of you out there, and also free speech advocates in the audience, I'll warn you now that if you haven't already gotten flack for trying to be nonpartisan, it will happen eventually, but please stay strong. Fire Where I Work is a nonpartisan organization, and we're continually being labeled either liberal or conservative by people who are the opposite. And it's easy to accuse us of basically anything if you're talking to lazy readers, because we've defended viewpoints on both sides of all the big controversial issues, so you can just sort of cherry pick your cases to prove your point. But as we continue our work, it also becomes easier to rebut these accusations of partisanship. So sure, on the one hand, we defended the rights of student groups to be recognized by their school when they're fighting for traditional marriage, but on the other hand, we've also spoken up repeatedly when state legislatures punished schools financially for assigning LGBT-themed books to their freshmen. We've also reminded students and administrators that bigoted speech is usually protected speech. And with other topics, we've defended pro-life groups and pro-choice groups. And we've celebrated when those groups fought for each other's free speech rights in the face of administrative censorship, which is always nice to see. We've fought for the rights of students, advocating for animal rights, gun rights, marijuana legislation reform, privacy rights, and innumerable other topics. So after a while, our history began to speak for itself. And so for those of you who are providing platforms to a range of viewpoints or defending the rights of all sorts of different students, your history will start to speak for itself too. So I hope for those among you who normally advocate for speech restrictive policies, I hope I've at least given you one or two things to think about. For the free speech allies in the audience, I hope I've given you a little bit more ammunition and some encouragement, hopefully. And for those of you on the fence, please speak up during the Q&A session. I'd love to hear from you. For administrators and policy writers, I'd urge you to work with FIRE to make Kenyon's speech policies as clear and consistent as possible. Kenyon's student handbook says that students and employees retain a right to free expression and free inquiry. But it also says they can't use offensive language or offend someone else's sensibilities. So administrators, if there's any out there, you might not intend on employing these provisions to stifle debate, but it will be very easy for those who follow in your footsteps to do so. And so in order to ensure that Kenyon students and faculty can enjoy robust free speech rights indefinitely and not just right now, not just while you're still here, it's essential that college policies be written in a way that does not facilitate administrative abuse. And FIRE is always happy to work with administrators and policy writers to make sure that student and faculty free speech rights are protected. So with that, I will take questions. I don't want to just
Grab the mic. If you wouldn't mind waiting for the mic and stating your name, we'll do it that way.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a sophomore. You mentioned the His Campus thing, and I know a couple of people who were responding to the His Campus by the articles on His Campus and felt threatened by it, and felt that they couldn't essentially speak out in direct rebuttal to the articles without being either threatened or feeling like their authority would be undermined, feeling that others would look at them as being shrill or as not having any authority on any of the topics. And that goes to a topic of authority and whether or not people feel like they're safe when they can speak up. And so the whole idea of having a free marketplace of ideas, I think that appeals to me. And I think that is like the ideal situation. But oftentimes it doesn't seem like it is as easy as possible to get to that place because there are people who feel as though they can't speak without their authority being undermined. My question is that feeling of having your authority undermined entirely on that person? And if it is, what can that person do? And if not, what accommodations should be made for that person?
Sure. Okay. There's sort of two separate issues that I want to touch on. The first is the issue of safety. It's exceedingly important that the school ensure that its students are safe, and if there's anything that they're doing that gives people a reasonable feeling that they're not going to be physically safe, then that's something that the administration definitely needs to work on. If people feel that the threat is people not taking them seriously or respecting them the same way or not viewing them as an authority, that is not something that the school can solve for them. And I think that it's just a matter of being persuasive, and it could be that progress is slow in that regard. So I definitely understand being frustrated with that. But the problem is that when a school starts to get involved on their behalf in those sorts of situations, it'll eventually make things worse, essentially, because then you have an authority who is controlling speech. You never know how that's going to pan out. And so ultimately, it's better to let students retain that sort of power and work things out among themselves by, being persuasive and making their points.
So we also often talk about on campus about students' free speech right, but we also talk about their right to academic freedom. I was wondering, has the Supreme Court made a distinction between free speech and academic freedom, and do students have the same academic freedom rights as, say, their professors do?
So normally when I hear people talk about academic freedom, it's more in the context of professors, so this might just be a sort of different people using the language, different way kind of issue. Free speech rights of students are broader and more concretely established than those of professors, in part because professors are employers, or employees, they have certain things that they have to do in certain ways that their employer can control them. Between free speech and academic freedom, free speech is, again, more concretely defined, whereas academic freedom is more of a underlying principle that sort of guides things but doesn't precisely dictate the law. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Hi, my name is Scott Schaefer.
Yep.
And I want to preface that what I'm going to say isn't, as far as I can tell, codified by law.
Okay.
So anyway, you made an argument that I want to address where you said protecting free speech. So you said something to the effect of protecting free speech gives the bigots a chance to out themselves, whereas censoring free speech means we won't know who is and who isn't bigoted in their views. So anyway, I want to mention that it seems to me that culturally there's an accepted ban on particular words that you could think of a bunch of different ones, the
Right.
N-word, for instance, things of that nature. Do you think that cultural prohibition that we sort of have is in itself counterproductive because we kind of have to hide the bigots because they cannot say that?
I think that, I guess this is sort of a multi-part answer. I think a lot of them aren't deterred by that sort of social ban. I think that a lot of them might be deterred but find other very harsh language to use. But to some extent, I guess it doesn't really matter because there's nothing we can do about it, legally speaking. If there's social norms, that's just, that's something that's something that exists, and I don't think there's really a way to sort of counteract if people are dissuaded from, for example, using the N-word. So it's interesting to think about. Ultimately, I think that because there aren't that many things that are really so socially frowned upon as using the N-word, I think most other things people will go ahead and say. So I'm not sure that has a huge effect on the benefit that I was discussing of knowing who the Nazi in the room is. But in some communities it might. Yeah, I don't know. I think it'd be sort of interesting, I guess, to see how things play out if that were the case.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I was really shocked in the aftermath of the Middlebury case, as well as the Claremont one that just occurred. And in particular, I was reading a lot of the student reactions. The New York Times had published a bunch of the student statements. And one theme that kind of was threaded in them was something about like the elevated platform. That's just the fact that the fundamental format of these types of interactions between students who's obviously disagree with the speaker, they feel that the fact that they're on a stage that's higher than them and that they have like a very small time at the end to ask questions, they think that that format fundamentally doesn't give them a way to debate the things that they disagree with. So I don't know if you think that there is any way that we could fundamentally reform to maybe perhaps make it more Socratic. I do know that it seems just illogical just because there's oftentimes, hundreds or dozens of people in the audience and just one speaker. But I don't know, with that in mind, if you think there could be any reforms so that students feel that they don't need to get disruptive to have their voices heard, that it's not just a 5-minute, 10-minute period where they can ask a question or two and have it maybe brushed off, but they feel that they can legitimately have their voices heard.
I definitely understand concerns if the Q&A session is not long enough to accommodate everyone, and I personally think it's always good to have nice and long sessions so that everyone can have their question answered. I think that even if it's a situation where there are hundreds of audience members and one speaker on stage, I've seen plenty of videos of single questions go viral, and so I'm not really convinced that that setup necessarily precludes someone making their point and embarrassing someone, because I've seen that happen. I've seen that be successful, or at least what I think the person asking the question would call successful. Yeah, and I also think that one way that people can see more of what they want to, the more of the people they want to see on stage, is by inviting the people that they want to see to come talk on stage. One person's presence or one person talking and giving their speech does not preclude others doing so. So I mean, I think it's partly that there are ways to make that question count, and partly that there are other ways to make up for, someone you don't like getting the spotlight.
What are the legal limitations, if any, on a public university's right to cancel scheduled speakers on the purported basis that they fear violence? For example, what Berkeley just did again.
So a public university's ability to cancel speakers to some extent depends on who invited the speaker. If it's the school who decided that they wanted someone to come, they can change their mind. A lot of people would argue that that's illiberal, but they can do it. If it is a student group that invited a speaker, assuming we're in the normal situation where the school has, a setup where lots of different student groups with different ideas all, share from the same student fee funding and all that stuff. If a student group does that, and there are concerns about violence, maybe they need extra security, the school should be paying for that security. It is not on the students to deal with the violent reactions of people who disagree with them, because otherwise it would basically be taxing certain kinds of speech just because other people disagree or want to cause a fight. So it depends on how things came about. Mm-hmm. Or where's the microphone?
Hi. So in your speech, you talked about the benefits of free and open discourse, which sound very great, and they should be part of everyone's academic experience. But at small liberal arts schools like Kenyon, there can often exist a culture of a very homogenous belief system among the students, where a lot of those benefits might not be fully realized, even if the administrative policy is to allow such free expression. What would you recommend for individual students to encourage a culture of free and open discourse in a place like Kenyon?
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely be harder at smaller schools, and one thing that I've seen that at least appears successful from the outside is really just like putting yourself out there, which I understand is not easy for everyone to do, but announcing yourself as someone who wants to either form a group that hosts debates or just hosts like brown bag lunches where people can talk about whatever issues, and setting up different sorts of events. You guys have a beautiful open space in the middle of campus, and so a good way to find the kind of people who want to have these open conversations is to, set up a free speech wall, or we see people setting up free speech balls, which are just these like huge beach balls, which I think are cool. But anyway, so there's just, I think making it very clear and obvious and like visually obvious that, that's, you know, why you're here at college, to have these conversations, I think will attract similarly minded people in that regard, similarly minded people to you, because a lot of times I think it's sort of hard for people to find each other. But especially I think with your campus setup, there are ways to do it. And if you want help setting up that sort of event or suggestions, you can always email me or my colleague Molly, who does our campus outreach, and we have a lot of resources on the FIRE website for ideas of how to do that too.
So I have two questions. Yeah, okay, so I have two questions. First, you're talking a lot about definitions and how important they are to establishing debate, right, and discourse generally. What happens when people simply don't agree on these definitions, right? That seems to happen all the time. Like, we can't seem to figure out what a base to, like, a foundation to start our discussions from. Seems to be a big problem in modern day. And two, would you know, what would you say to the question about, or the statement that safe spaces are, like, in a way, prevent meaningful discourse so far as they create like segregated spaces, right, that these discussions have? At least in my personal experience, I found that there are a lot of interesting groups and clubs we have on this campus that have a lot of really great and interesting discussions, but we never get together and actually talk about them because we're isolated. So even if it's not like outside of the concept of a safe space, and isn't part of that process of growing and actually getting something out of discourse, being uncomfortable with the opinion you're facing and dealing with that emotion, that feeling, and getting comfortable with ambiguity in life, right? Like, that seems just to be sort of something that is necessary to kind of get past, like, gridlock, like, politically, et cetera. So what would you sort of say to those statements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely part of getting all you can get out of college is being uncomfortable. And that's why I recommend using sort of a combination of, you know, going to the places that you're uncomfortable, but then stepping out of that. And I think that probably you won't get the most out of college if you do strictly one or the other, but it's really about sort of shifting back and forth in the combination. So I agree with you that if people stay in their segregated spaces all the time, they're really not getting as much out of the community as they could. But I think it's useful as sort of a sometimes tool. So I would agree on that point. As far as defining terms, and if you don't agree, I don't think you have to agree on what the terms should mean per se, but I think that people need to at least figure out what they're talking about. So, you know, if two people are talking about feminism and one person thinks that that's, you know, equal voting rights and the other person thinks that that's, I mean, I don't even know, just something else, then if they're having a conversation, even if they disagree about like what the dictionary should say, they can at least have that conversation with the understanding that when that person uses that word, that is what they mean. So as long as they understand sort of the temporary rules of the conversation that they're having, I don't think that it needs to be some permanent decision about what the dictionary should say. It's just really more about mutual understanding.
Don't they get different things then out of that, right? Like, don't they get different understandings out of that discussion? So.
Well, it's like if
I mean, like, if we're operating with different definitions, right? If I think justice is one thing, this person knows justice is another thing.
But you know that that person, when they are talking about it, means something
right,
else.
But what are, like, my point is, what are we getting from, right? Because we're just going to different places. So I understand that your position is this, but because I reject your position, like, I like, you know, ignore all these other implications of that, like, of your argument, right?
I mean, you can.
Where are we going?
You can disagree with them, but I think that a lot of times when people talk past each other, it's because they don't understand what the other person is actually trying to communicate, because they're using a word in a different way than how they use it. So they think that people might think that they disagree when really they're just using one word differently.
So I had a question about different forms of speech. So do you think it matters if speech comes in a form of, say, graphic arts, such as very shocking depictions, visual depictions of something that might be considered threatening, like aborted fetuses, that kind of thing. And similarly, what if speech comes in the form of sound, like sound from a bullhorn that drowns out what other people are trying to say? Do you think that there should be special regulation of those kinds of speech?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad that you asked. With respect to sound and other things that are disruptive in a way that's really not connected to the content or the message of whatever is being conveyed, schools and the government can have reasonable content-neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. And they're exactly for that purpose. You can't stand outside with a megaphone at 2 a.m. outside the dorms and, give your rant on climate change or whatever. And that's not related to, the policy won't say don't talk about climate change. It'll say don't use a megaphone outside at 2 a.m. And as long as it's narrowly tailored to, achieve a content-neutral purpose like that, like not disrupting people, and it's neutrally applied, that's allowable. I'm trying to remember the first part of the question. Graphic art. I don't think that we can start drawing the line between, for example, graphic art and text. And the law doesn't draw that line except for in the case of obscenity. Obscenity is kind of a weird thing for me to talk about because, first of all, it's rarely relevant in the campus context. Obscenity laws are rarely enforced, but I also happen to disagree with obscenity existing as an unprotected category of speech. So that's a little bit complicated, but the gist is that obscenity is an incredibly narrow category of speech. So the vast majority of things would not fall into that category, and the vast majority of very graphic images would still be protected by the First Amendment. I don't think that I would call pictures of aborted fetuses threats because I'm not sure who they would be threatening to. I mean, it's not conveying an intent to hurt anybody. It's just a picture of arguably a person or a living thing that has been hurt. So I don't think that would fall into any of the categories of unprotected speech, and I think it's just one of those things that people are, it's part of the range of speech that is protected under the First Amendment.
Hi, Brooks Alderman. So this is sort of more in line with the due process side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Kenyon recently switched from a student conduct review board for dealing with Title IX cases to a dual investigator model. Do you think this is a step in the right direction, or do you think this is a step backwards?
So it's hard for me to give a very solid answer without looking, but so I assume you're looking at a situation where it's essentially two people kind of making all the decisions involved in the case?
I believe that that's correct. One of them is a member of the Kenyon community, and the other one is hired from the outside.
Okay. I think that student disciplinary hearings are stronger and more able to reach accurate findings when they involve more than just one or two people. If it's just one or two people who are listening to the evidence and deciding what evidence they're considering and deciding who they believe more, especially in these very hard cases, I think if there's only one or two people, it's very easy for either error or unconscious bias to have a determinative effect on the outcome. And that doesn't mean that they're a bad person, it's just that we're all human. And part of the reason why the criminal justice system has so many people in very separated roles is to protect against that sort of error. So I always prefer to see, and FIRE prefers to see, situations where there are, like in the criminal justice system, different people with different roles, all as neutral as they can be, with the exception of the prosecutorial role and any attorneys involved on both sides, and of course the parties. But yeah, I think it's really hard to provide all the procedural safeguards that accused students should have with that sort of setup.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi. So I was on the committee that wrote our new policy on free expression that the faculty is considering. And one of the hardest things for us to figure out was what spaces should have what level of freedom of expression on campus, because we felt like the dorms in particular were a difficult case. And for me, I kept coming back to the idea of the private sphere versus the public sphere, or the fact that when I go home to my home, it's a private home. I have control over who comes in. I have control over what media I can listen to or view, and that's really important to my well-being, and kept thinking about the students, like they don't have a home, a private space on campus. The private space is their room. And so is there any kind of law or best principles or other kinds of precedents for different spaces on campus being treated differently, or dorms having special rules?
Yeah, I mean, I just sort of on a human level, I definitely understand having trouble with that because, like you say, you don't really have a house that you can go to. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, there's not really a way to separate public from private space except to say that a student's actual room is their own space. They can make their own rules for that. And outside in the common areas is essentially public space. So I think that in a way that's the rule that makes the most sense. I'm trying to think if there's, I mean, I don't remember reading any specific case law relating to this situation. So it might be the sort of thing where cases just didn't really come up.
I thought there was some case law about the door of the dorm room, that you can put political speech on your dorm room door. And there was some pro-Iraq war posters that some students put up at the University of Texas, and the administration asked them taken down, and they were fire got involved. And
well, there's definitely been a lot of fire cases involving things posted on doors, and in those cases, we've always argued that people shouldn't be censored by public institutions just for their viewpoint. So I think one of our biggest cases involved actually a professor on his office door. And essentially, with those cases, usually it ends up being a situation where they could have bans on just hanging things outside your doors generally, but that's not what they do. Instead, they end up selectively enforcing rules against people whose viewpoints that they don't like, or just, enforcing a rule that doesn't exist to tear down posters they don't like. And that sort of viewpoint discrimination is really exactly the sort of thing that shouldn't be happening on a public college campus. So I think there's sort of lots of permutations of that. I'm trying to remember exactly your question. So
well, I guess sort of like free speech does stop at the dorm room door or the professor's office door.
Yeah, I think that that's the way that makes the most sense, is for the person whose room or office that is, to sort of like dictate the rules inside.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that this has happened here, but many campuses, the issue comes up, especially for graduation speakers, or times when the speech is also an honor, and also there are scarce resources going into who gets the chance to have the speak. Mm-hmm. So, or there are, the campus can bring 3 major speakers. So then there's an issue of, are we using scarce resources to present an idea that is anathema to someone? How does FIRE navigate those waters?
I mean, I think this is one of those issues that where the law takes a little bit of a back seat to just the practical implications of things. First of all, I think that schools need to, frankly, do a better job of researching the people that they choose to honor before they decide to honor them, if that's what they're doing. Because, I mean, I feel like if I picked someone for an honor and then a bunch of students pointed out some shady stuff they had in their background, I would be like really embarrassed that I didn't do my homework. But I don't know, I'm not an administrator. So that's one aspect of things. Because things look very different when you initially decide to make a certain decision versus when you make a decision and then backpedal. So, I mean, that's one thing to consider. But I also think that you have to think about the fact that these graduation ceremonies, they're meant to be celebrations of the students. And a lot of times, people who have shady stuff in their past give really good graduation speeches. And if you try to, eliminate everyone who has something that makes them objectionable, you're going to find that students can find some reason to object to basically anyone, and B, your choices are just going to get narrower and narrower. So you sort of have to decide, is that the direction you want to go or not? And if that is the direction the administration wants to go, that's fine, that's their decision. But I think that it can get really messy, and I don't know, it's just, there's just sort of different factors that colleges and universities need to balance and see what kind of look they want to have, see whether they would rather have potentially more interesting speakers who maybe did something that somebody doesn't like. And I don't think that there's one right answer, but I think that sometimes people have expectations for the administration that is, I guess, a little bit unreasonable, just because there's so many people who have these weird things that you can pick on. So I know that's sort of a wishy-washy answer, but hopefully it helps a little bit.
So first of all, I apologize for being elevated above you. But
I'm really short.
I'm going to, bear with me, I'm going to refer to a movie. It's The Bonfire of the Vanities. It's kind of a movie with a lot of really despicable and shady people.
Mm-hmm.
In the closing scene, a judge in a courtroom, played by Morgan Freeman, gets fed up with everybody. They're all scoundrels, and he delivers a kind of sermon that says, "Go home and be good people, be decent to one another." And so my question for you is, and I understand, of course, you have to come at this, especially from a public perspective, through the legal lens. But how is it that decency can come back in here, that civility can come back in here? How do you, on the one hand, rigidly kind of defend a hard line for free speech and hope that the bigots will be sorted out in the process, while simultaneously kind of encouraging civility and encouraging decency?
I think that there's not one right way to encourage civility. I think part of it is just demonstrating that, each of us demonstrating that ourselves, and demonstrating that it works better than hostility, if that's what you believe. And I guess for me, it's not so hard making the legal social distinction, in part because it's just pretty deeply ingrained in me, but also because I've seen, I think that we've all seen powerful changes happen without interference from the law. Granted, I read a lot of, all those articles. If you haven't read it, Google the story of Megan Ropes-Felper, or I don't know which way her names go. But anyway, she's a former member of the Westboro Baptist Church, and she basically was converted by people being civil to her and engaging with her in this very polite way, and just seeing the way that people can change. And I know that, obviously she's one individual, but over time, I think that can happen with lots of people. And so it definitely requires a certain amount of optimism that ultimately, civility and being decent people will win out in the end. But I think, it's just, that is sort of all you can do, is kind of live the way that you want to see other people live, and hope that it catches on. I guess I don't know if that's too depressing an answer but.
Well, I think if nobody has any other questions, we're going to call her. Thank you very much, Susan. We quite appreciate it.